remember that. Okay, so I'm Naomi. I'm going to introduce you to Timo in just a moment. I am one of the founding directors of Cape Coaching and Development. And what matters to us and what we're all about is helping people managers to have more impact by enabling them to have the confidence to have the conversations that matter. And so for us, this particular topic about imposter syndrome is the one that we get asked about the most. Right, is the question and the kind of topic that we find ourselves either talking to people about in our coaching conversations, in the programs that we run, or in the engagement that we have on our socials. But before I get started, I'm just going to quickly check if you're in and you're not on mute. Maybe just pop yourself on mute just in case there's any background noise. There we go. So I had a bit of a strange thing happen as I was putting together this webinar, and I have read since that people who are talking about imposter syndrome have a similar thing, and that is that I found myself thinking, okay, so I'm going to be speaking to tens of nearly 100 people potentially, or listening back about me talking about a topic that I know some things about, I have worked with quite a lot of people about, but do I have enough credibility to talk about this topic? Can I add value? And I found myself scouring articles and getting in deep dark holes of new data around the topic, to really think about how I could position this. And as the numbers on our webinar ticked up, that unease became even more present. And then, as you're probably sitting there thinking, actually, that is imposter syndrome in action. It clicked. For me, being able to create an environment and a webinar for you that has you going away feeling like it had been really useful, having that as the expectation that I was putting on myself made me feel as if I was actually over preparing, not necessarily acknowledging the value and the tools and the background that I can bring to this. So that reflection, as you can expect, was somewhat ironic, thinking about the topic that we're going to be talking about. And as we start to explore this, I'm going to say at the outset that this discussion will probably raise more questions for you than it might give answers, but isn't that the point of learning overall? For us, and hopefully you kind of you go with that concept too, it's about enabling conversations. It's about opening up a space to be curious and to reflect and to develop greater awareness of ourselves and how we act in different situations, because having awareness ultimately gives us greater choice. So our aim for this webinar and for all the others that we run is to open up some of the conversations that are going to be important for you to have for yourselves and with your teams. Please interact via the chat as we go through. Please ask questions there. We'll have some time for questions at the end as well. And it's not going to be me talking at you at all. I'm going to do a little bit of a setting the scene, and then I'm going to bring Timo in and we're going to have a bit of a discussion about this and what it's like for us and our experiences. So what we're going to cover, what actually we mean by imposter syndrome, how we can help ourselves and our teams, and some really practical ideas and thoughts about what to do about it. So before I go on any further, Timo, do you want to just say a quick hello to everybody and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Naomi, for making that introduction. So I'm obviously Timo, I'm a partner at Human Aid. And I know the irony feeling that you just described, because when you first asked me to co-present this webinar, I was like, really, I don't know anything about this. So I was actually a bit surprised that you asked me, but then obviously we had good discussions on why I could join. And I'm happy to share some of my experiences that I had myself, but also with colleagues. So very much looking forward to this one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Timo. Okay, so let's just start by thinking about what this term means to you, because it's fair to say that it's a term that's probably used in quite a blanket approach way, quite general way, quite often. But when we think about this term, what does it mean to you, or what words does it create for you? Just use the chat and let's start seeing the variety that might be out there. What does this mean to you? Okay. Yeah. So starting out straight away, being negative, inferior. Should I really be here? Yeah, that not deserving, lacking confidence, not qualified. I gave you that example at the beginning that although I talk about this topic and I've read lots on this topic, as I was putting together the materials, I'm thinking, who am I to be talking about this? Yeah, might get found out, that sense of what does that, what if this is the moment, the feeling of not belonging, or that you don't deserve a seat at the table. Yeah. And that it can be almost even in those situations when, should I say this point? Should I make this comment in this meeting? That comparison to others, feeling like a bit of a fraud. I think that sums it up perfectly, doesn't it, Joel? We have lots of different, we might have lots of different definitions of this. And part of what we'll hopefully come on to talk about is the fact that it all has different ways of presenting itself for us. But generally, it's about that idea of feeling as if you don't deserve the success that you have, or that you're a bit of a fraud. So it's important to say that it's not a fear of failure. And it's important to say that it's not a fear of being able to do something. These two quotes, I think, for me, I know some of you have said some of the words included here, but this feeling that you don't deserve the success that you have, or the achievements that you've had, or this feeling of intellectual fraudulence, comparison to others. Am I qualified? Am I credible? Some of those words I used from before. I watched a YouTube video where someone, again in my anxious prep for covering all bases. There we go. My anxious need to prep and cover all bases. This sensation of getting away with something, of being found out as a fraud. So some of the other things that people talk about, this feeling of persistent or intermittent self-doubt, the fact that we might attribute successes or achievements that we've had to luck, to something else other than us actually being good at what we're doing, that we compare ourselves to others, that we heavily rely on external validation. We can't internalize our own successes, that we downplay our expertise. I'm sure some of us have used that phrase. I might not be the expert here, but, or I might not, I know you know a lot more than me, but we downplay what we bring and what we know. Sometimes it's the other side. I know I saw your comment, Leanne. Sometimes it's that point around overcompensating, and that we might see or experience others who have a really false exterior confidence to kind of compensate for some of the feelings of self-doubt. Perfectionism, setting unrealistic expectations and goals for ourselves, or, actually holding ourselves back because of that fear of what might happen if we put ourselves out there. And I think some of the writing around this, and that's one thing to say, a huge amount of writing on this topic, which I think is sometimes the challenge, that the difference between self-confidence or lack of self-confidence and imposter syndrome is important. lacking self-confidence is an aspect of imposter syndrome, but usually with imposter syndrome, we have had a level of success. That person who's suffering from imposter syndrome has achieved some level of success in an area of their life, but they struggle to attribute that success to their own ability. Whereas a person with low self-confidence might not actually start to work towards their own goals. And it's often what, I think we can think, as with a lot of things, we can look to neuroscience to help us understand the basis of some of these things. Our brains still work initially in a way that is based on that fight or flight, that cave person brain, that reptilian part of our brain that responds and prepares and protects us against threat. So it's almost that inner security of, in cave times, in evolutionary times, telling ourselves not to step out of our cave, not to kind of, what might happen, the fear and the risks. And especially this might be present when we put ourselves in new or out of our comfort zone situations. Our brain's telling us there's some risk or some threat here. And we therefore kind of respond to that. And the feeling can be amplified if we're more senior, if we have more people dependent on us. Lots of people talk about some of the coping strategies being around perfectionism or actually procrastination. So in terms of, just before I open up and we have a bit more of a discussion around this, in terms of what was some of the early basis, some of the early work that defined this term, and yeah, I think that final definition there, it can apply to anyone who can't internalize their success. So the origins of imposter syndrome, let's just think about that for a minute, because I think that's quite helpful when we think about what it means and where it comes from. So some of you, I'm sure, are aware of this already, but the term imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon is on there, was first defined by two American psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who were in their work as psychologists, they were working with highly successful women, PhDs, people who had respected professional careers or highly achieving academics. And despite all of the feedback and the grades and the tangible evidence of their success, they didn't believe they deserved that success, even to the point that an error had occurred in them in the grade marking or in the selection for a role, and they were suffering from some anxiety, depression, real mental health challenges associated with the feelings around that. And even though these two psychologists could understand and theoretically explain all the reasons to these women why they were wrong, they also themselves, these two highly acclaimed professionals, also experience this feeling too. And they defined it in their paper of 1978 as phoniness in people who believe that they're not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite evidence of high achievement. And even though, maybe unhelpfully actually, and we'll come on to think about this, the study was based predominantly or entirely actually on women, the authors at the time theorized that this was a condition, a symptom, an experience, a phenomenon, whatever we want to call it, that was unique to women. Much later, these authors and many others have identified that actually it's not, that men and women can experience these feelings. More recent studies show us that anywhere between, and there's quite a big range here, but anywhere between 50 and 82% of us will experience some of these symptoms, some of these things that we're talking about at some point in their lives. Evidence says that it's most common in high achievers. And it's interesting there, we'll think maybe about this idea of this vicious cycle that we might get stuck in as high achievers. And it's also, even though the evidence has proven that it's men and women, it's more prevalent, or it's been found more recently to be more prevalent in marginalized groups. So, some of the thinking behind that is that when people don't see examples of people who are like them, look like them, are from their backgrounds, who are succeeding in their field, the chances of them feeling this sense of being an imposter is increased. And there's lots and lots of research that also points to situational context being important. The environment that you're in, the role that you're doing, where you are in your career, whatever it is, that it's not something that you are suffering from your whole lives necessarily, or to the same extent, that situation and context can play a big part. So just thinking about what I've shared there for a second, I'm just going to launch a quick poll, completely anonymous, but just have a think about, with some of those symptoms, characteristics, how often have you experienced them? Just going to pause and let people fill that in. Wow. Okay, so there's our 100% nearly. So it's interesting. I'm just going to give it 10 seconds more. There's a couple of you who, if you join by the web browser, sometimes don't get the polls launched, but we've got a good percentage. All right, I'm going to end that now and just share those results. Okay, so can you see those? Yeah. So no one said never. It's interesting. Equal proportions of people have said all the time or a couple of times, but the biggest percentage, so 71% of the people who responded talk about experiencing this quite frequently. I would definitely put myself in the quite frequently category too. So our stats of between 50 and 82% of people, we fall quite well within that, in that poll. Really interesting. And why should we care? Because you could argue, well, actually, if it's most prevalent in high achievers, if it's so prominent, it is quite surprising. Then why should we actually care? We should care because as people who are part of organizations, as people who are leading teams, who are responsible for the delivery of projects and outcomes for clients, for customers, for whoever it is, the impact of having some of these experiences are that people hold themselves back. They don't seek out help or support maybe when they might need to, from a fear of wondering what somebody might think of them. They might turn down opportunities because of the fear around, am I really the right person to do that job? They might not be able to fulfill their potential. I think there's so many aspects, and I'm really interested in this idea of how much energy we expend at work trying to overcome an obstacle. So if we think about, we talk a lot about the term psychological safety, for example, when people don't feel psychologically safe, how much energy we might expend trying to sense out and sound out whether the room feels okay. I worked with a client recently, and she shared with me that actually she challenged something that was really important to her, but the amount of energy that it took her to build herself up to challenging meant that she was that was her done. She was quite exhausted. So the amount of energy we might be expending outside of being able to deliver what we need to deliver, and that has to go somewhere. So it might impact our productivity, but it also might impact, on the other side of things, how much of a work-life balance we have, how likely it is that we'll suffer from burnout, and how it might impact our job satisfaction, whether we stay in a role, whether we have capacity to think innovatively, especially if we're expending a lot of energy on managing this fear of being found out. And it can lead to anxiety, depression even, and really poor self-care and boundaries. So that's what it is. That's what it means and the impact that it can have. So I'm going to stop sharing. Timo, what are your thoughts on what you've heard so far? What stood out for you so far?
A lot of interesting stuff, to be honest, and very recognizable. Maybe my first reflection is that I actually don't really like the term imposter syndrome. We've talked about this. It feels imposter syndrome, it feels like so heavy. I feel like the name alone already prevents us from discussing it or talking about it. And I think, as we're doing with this session, it's just important to show to people that you're not alone in this. We've seen the results of the poll. Obviously, we have people joining this session, so we might have a bit of a biased group here, but I think it's important that we share the fact that, what was it, 50 to 82% will experience this at some point, so that a lot of people experience this, that it is common to high achievers, which is for me a paradox. Like, it could also be the imposter paradox, like people that are intelligent enough and that are actually becoming already self-aware that experience this. So that's interesting to me as well, but equally so that it is in a lot of cases also situational. I think that's important, and I think we'll come back to that later in the session. That's important to recognize those situations as well. And I think what we're doing here and making it accessible, discussing it, and I think what you were doing, describing some of the characteristics, makes it also for me so much more recognizable and identifiable. So it makes that the conversation is easier to have by discussing some of the characteristics and the feelings that you can experience, rather than talking about the strict definition or the term imposter syndrome alone, because, as I said, it feels so heavy. So yeah, for me, that's kind of my first reflection. It's about how each and every one of us feels it individually, which type of feelings that you have, which type of characteristics that you can recognize with. That's like the first thing that I got out of this first block, I would say.
Yeah, and I think when we initially started talking about this, I think we shared similar views. I agree. I'm not a big fan of the idea of it being a syndrome. I think in some ways that label can almost work to further exacerbate the feelings of, okay, so there's something wrong with me for feeling this way. I think sometimes having a label to it is helpful if it opens up the conversation. It's helpful if it allows people to start to think about it and start to talk about it. But it's not helpful if it's a generic term that or a box that we put people in.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think if it's helping people to raise awareness, and interestingly, actually, I've just got a note in front of me. One of the most widely shared articles in the history of Harvard Business Review. So, an American publication that actually, if any of you haven't come across it, you don't have to be a subscriber. You can get, I think, 3 or 4 articles a month, and there's some really, really interesting stuff on there. But one of their most widely shared articles was the one entitled "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome," because of that fact that if we look at it just on paper, 2 American psychologists did a study about women in the academic environment, and therefore what's gone from that at one extreme is that we've put maybe women more into this camp of, oh, okay, if you doubt yourself, that means you must have imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. It's not about fixing it's about trying to fix the person as opposed to fixing maybe the environment that they work in. And that's why this idea of it being situational is really important, helping people to think about what is it about this environment and this situation that I'm in that's maybe making this more prevalent or having more of an impact. So yeah, it starts the discussion. And how have you seen it play out? Is it something that you've experienced, or have you seen it play out in other people?
Yeah, definitely experienced myself from time to time, seen it with colleagues, people that I coach, even with family and friends. And I think if we're talking about situations or contexts that cause these kinds of feelings, I think typically when I see people take up a new task, a new role, a new responsibility, that's when people obviously still need to learn a lot of things on the job, and when these types of feelings typically come up, I would say something new can sometimes be very exciting for someone, but at the same time also very scary, I would say. People start to feel very insecure. And I think it's interesting because I think I once read an article or someone told it to me that when you take up a new responsibility or a new role, it can take up until 12 months or even longer until you fully master, well, not even fully mastered it, but you just start to feel comfortable enough to share that you are an expert in the matter, or that you start to feel confident enough to share things with your colleagues. And something I have seen as well when I shifted or moved to another responsibility, for example, at like the first few months, you kind of have this increasing feeling of am I here in the right place? Am I gonna be found out that I was maybe not that good after all, or did they rightfully promote me or give me this job? So that's, I would say, definitely a situation where I have seen it played out.
Yeah. So that part about it being when it's a new role, and I suppose what immediately I think about when you talk about that example is, we often have these unrealistic or unfair comparisons that we make. So we come into a new role, we see somebody else and what they're doing, and either we assume, okay, I should be doing exactly as they're doing, however they've been in the role for however long, or we're making assumptions about how that person feels about themselves as well. I often use this analogy of a bit like a duck on the water. When we think about ourselves, we see everything that's going on in our minds, the times when we've messed up in the past. When we see other people in action, all we see is the image that we get in front of us in that moment in time. We judge it on that. So it's that whole concept of, you might see someone presenting and think, wow, I wish I had the confidence that they had. What we don't see is the amount of prep or the amount of kind of strategies that they have to get themselves to a place where they feel okay to do that, and how they're feeling inside. So when it's something new, it's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think maybe a second thing that I've seen with colleagues or friends is that there's also this tendency to overcompensate by working more hours or spending a lot of time on a task. And what obviously is a coping mechanism is trying to be perfectionist to kind of control those feelings, like to do as good as possible, because that pushes maybe away those feelings of insecurity or whatever. And the problem with that is that probably can't be a structural solution, because eventually you will get stuck. You cannot keep on increasing your effort on something. And that's what I see in those situations, that people, they don't see it clearly anymore. They don't see the bigger picture anymore. So this overcompensation, I think, is also something that I have seen with people getting stuck at a certain point.
Yeah. Almost that you use that word control, that we
Yeah.
feel like this, we're trying to control everything. And I think there's often, I think about the 3 Ps around how people manage this. The pressure that they put on themselves probably either leads to perfectionism or it leads to procrastination, that avoidance of it, and one or the other. I know for me, I've already shared, and I'm really open about the fact that this is something that I have experienced throughout my career, especially as a people manager. And actually, I think it's in a large part why I do what I do now. Mm-hmm. The experiences that I had when I was a people manager were quite challenging. Not only the early roles that I had as a people manager, but as I developed and grew in my career, every time somebody gave me a promotion, I'd be thinking, God, this time they're going to find out. And I think that it was even more of an issue when I led teams and I didn't know the detail. So I've shared with some of you before that I'm an engineer by background. And, initially some of the teams that I led were teams within the same field. So I had the expertise. Mm-hmm. I'd done the job before. I knew what I was talking about. And I had that gave me a level of credibility in my mind. However, to lead a team, it's not about what you know necessarily. It's about how you are with people, how you build great teams, how you have human interactions, how you motivate and encourage, and all those things that we talk about a lot. But when you're a people manager and you're dealing with some of the symptoms of imposter syndrome, and then you don't have that credibility and you move to a team where you have to lead people and you don't know the detail, that can be really quite crippling sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, if I reflect on it, in some ways, having those experiences made me better at my job, because it made me really conscientious, really prepared for any meeting that I went into, really on top of everything that I needed to be on top of. So on one hand, it served me and it helped me. But I think on the other hand, it actually detracted from the impact that I could have as a people manager, mm-hmm. because it meant that I was had this real desire to feel in control and prove that I was worthy of the job. And therefore, I wasn't comfortable with admitting when I didn't know something. And I genuinely now think that one of the most powerful things we can do as a leader or as a people manager is to not have all the answers, is to admit that I don't quite know that, to bring people in, to help people to see that you don't have to be the one who knows everything, that they have the ability to do that. And I think having these symptoms of imposter syndrome meant that I wasn't necessarily able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good one. And I remember that I was talking to a friend a couple of months ago, and one of my closest friends, but he's also a CEO, so leading a company with many people. And he said to me, Timo, at a certain point, if I'm the smartest person around the table, then it's not a good situation anymore. I want to be the dumbest person around the table, because then I know that I have brought people around me that are actually experts in their field and that I can learn from them. So exactly, Naomi, I think that sometimes admitting or allowing that you don't know the answer, good as a leader. Yeah.
And I think, the other thing that I would say on this point around how you see it play out, as well as my experience from those roles, I've got the privilege, massive privilege, of coaching hundreds and hundreds of people around how to help them achieve what they want to achieve. And I see so often, and it genuinely is often the highest achievers who come and say, you know what, this is the only space I can really talk about this, but I feel like I'm winging it. Don't know if that translates, getting by every day. And we can get ourselves stuck into this vicious cycle of having to prove, and therefore having a new standard that we have to live up to, and a new one and a new one. And I've seen that play out in teams, but I've definitely seen that play out a lot in situations where I'm coaching really incredibly successful, intelligent, creative, innovative people, that there's that constant need to sort of prove, and that vicious cycle that we get into. So how would you support you? I know you've said you've seen it in your teams, or you've kind of experienced this being present within the environments that you've worked within. How would you support your colleagues, or how have you supported your colleagues?
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to tackle also here, because probably in the room here today, there's also people coaching or managing other people and wondering what some of the tactics can be if you're a coach yourself and you see this play out with people that you're coaching, for example. And I think there's a couple of things that we try to do in our team. And I think the first and the most important one to me is to make sure that we create a trusted environment where people feel safe to speak about how they feel, and that they feel that they can speak up. And I think as a leader, basically, you can contribute to that, like you said, Naomi, by sometimes also showing vulnerability at times, by showing or admitting that you don't know the answer, so that people in your team also notice that, and that they feel that they can share things, and that they can share when they are not knowing something or insecure, whether that's in a group environment or obviously also in a one-on-one conversation. But that's, like, for me, the first thing that you can do is create that trust environment where someone feels safe, that soon enough they will speak up if they are experiencing feelings close to imposter syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I completely agree with that point around sharing your experiences or normalizing it. Actually, we don't have time, I suppose, to list all of the evidence and examples of successful people who've talked about having some of these feelings, from Sheryl Sandberg to presidents who on their first day of walking into the Oval Office go, how did I get here? Oh, let's hope so if I can get away with it for the next 4 years. And Maya Angelou, who is a really famous poet and Nobel laureate, who has written, I think, Grammy nominated, has written about 11 books, and is famously quoted as saying every time she wrote a new book, this time I've fooled everyone to this point, this time they're going to find me out. So it's that the point around actually normalizing it. And you talked about sort of challenging and supporting as well, I think we've talked about this before, haven't we? That importance of bringing both challenge and support.
Yeah, exactly. I think the second thing, what we try to do in our team is also consider coaching people on their strengths as well as on their weaknesses or improvement points. I mean, too often I think we think of coaching as improving something that needs working on, like that it's something that needs to be solved, and like coaching conversations are to solve something. But I think it's also important that we think about coaching and coaching conversations to provide enough feedback also on people's strengths, so that they gain confidence as well. For example, what we do in our team is we try to make enough time to also celebrate successes. And each time when we do that, we try to make sure that we put everyone in the spotlight that has contributed to that success. So even if it's little things, but people are recognized for their contributions, and as such, you also actually provide feedback on things that they do well and gain confidence. That's also, I think, a mechanism in which sometimes the feelings of imposter syndrome can be a bit on the lower side because they see that they are rightfully in the place that they are, that they deserve that spot. So
yeah, really emphasizing that, because I think, we work with lots of people, and you'll go in and, what are the challenges within this team? We need to get better at giving difficult feedback, and there's a lot of focus on how do I give really good constructive feedback when something isn't going as well as it should be. And I think there should be as much focus on how do I give really good positive feedback, because often we like giving positive feedback, but it's you've done really well done, bit of a pat on the back, as opposed to useful positive feedback, as opposed to evidence that people can use to really own
exactly.
what it is that's had such a positive impact. So I think that's such an important point.
Yeah, and it needs to be indeed concrete, and it needs to be authentic at the point that you're giving that feedback. It cannot be on a good project like good project. It needs to be concrete to what that person has contributed to the project. I think,
Yeah,
so that they
absolutely.
also feel that it's honest and authentic feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Helping people to recognize, if we talk about imposter syndrome being when people aren't able to internalize the success or the achievements, actually helping people to see that, helping create that evidence base for people that this is why this has succeeded. This is why you are successful in this role or in this project. Yeah, thank you. And I think, just I suppose I'm going to leave a little bit of time for some questions, or for anybody else to join in the discussion. If you've got any particular examples or things that you want to share, use the chat. But just to sort of sum up some of the things that we've talked about so far, some strategies then. And Timo and I will have touched on these, but for me, there's three things that I want you to think about. The first one is, and this is for us and for our teams, the role we take for ourselves as individuals and the role we might take as a leader or a people manager. As with anything, when we have greater awareness, it gives us choices in how we might act, what we might do, the support we might seek. So to raise our awareness, firstly, making time for reflection, actually making time, rather than that instinct that we get when we come out of a situation, oh, what was it that I should have done better? Or what could I have done? Or where did I mess up? Actually pausing and reflecting in more of a balanced way. Thinking about, if we're really prepared, if we're considering that this is situational and context driven a lot of the time, thinking about some of the patterns that might be present, some of the situations, the triggers that might cause us to feel in this way more than others, and what is it about those situations, how can we maybe improve our experiences of those, or what might we need to do to tackle those actual situations. So if there's a particular meeting, a particular team meeting or leadership team meeting that you go to, and that's when you feel at your most of a fraud, what is it? What's causing that? Getting curious about that and understanding from others how you actually are in those meetings, getting reliable evidence, focusing your efforts on the places that maybe give more rise to this feeling than others. And both on your strengths as well. What are the situations where you're really not counting, or you're most actively discounting your strengths and your achievements? What is it about those situations? Noticing that imposter cycle, vicious cycle in action, noticing when we are getting into the realms of over preparing, over controlling our environment, and thinking about taking a step back then. And I often, when I talk to people about raising awareness when we think about ourselves and how we feel about ourselves, I often go to this model, and I'm just going to share it for a moment. Some of you might have come across this before. I don't like the language of competence, incompetence, but let's just go with it for a second. When we're at the bottom, we don't know what we don't know. So we go into a new role, we're starting within a new team, we know nothing about what that team does, we're blissfully unaware. We get to the second bit, okay, there's so much that I need to learn, I'm consciously aware of what I don't know. The third step on this ladder, okay, I've worked within this team for a while and I've got more familiar with some of those processes that I have to use. I have to still think about what I need to do in different situations. I still need to think about the process I have to go through when, managing a project, but I'm feeling more comfortable and we don't even think about it. So we start a project, we finish a project, and the steps that we've done in between are so natural to us, so well practiced and learned that it's unconscious, that autopilot. And the reason I use this model to think about how we see ourselves, and it links a lot to what Timo said before about imposter syndrome coming out more when we're in new environments. When we move into a place where we realize we don't know, human nature means we want to jump straight from here all the way to here. We don't like putting the effort in and doing the bit in between. And this bit, we experience that discomfort of learning, which can impact us and make us translate it into, I can't do something, or I'm not good enough for this, or I shouldn't be in this role. So there's an element of building our awareness of when we're in a stage of actually trying things that are new, pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones. And when we're doing that, that naturally creates tensions for us. We're in this sticky place of learning. Doesn't mean we're not good enough. We shouldn't appreciate what's got us here, but it's just a human process that we have to go through. So raising awareness. The second thing that I want to kind of leave you with in terms of strategy is we're raising our awareness is taking intentional action or not. So some of the things that we can do to take intentional action are actively bringing balance to our thinking. We will automatically go to the things that we don't think we've done well enough in. But thinking on, okay, but what is it that went well? That neuroplasticity point, our brains having the ability to grow new connections, new habits. If we force ourselves to not remove the negatives, but to actually bring some more balance, that can really help. Considering different perspectives, assessing the evidence. What was the evidence in that situation, in that meeting, when I felt as if I gave a point that was really confused and not clear? What's the evidence? Did anybody kind of look at me and sit up and say, I don't really know what you're talking about? Or did people nod and actually ask me a relevant question afterwards? What's the evidence? And a trick that I use here is, what would I say to my best friend? So if my best friend came to me and said, this is the situation and this is what I'm thinking, what would I say to them? Because 100% we will be much more balanced, kinder, and considered in the feedback we would give to somebody else than the thing that we're telling ourselves. And manage our comparisons. Use social media, use kind of that comparison making moderately. Be conscious about what it means for us and the impact that it has. Create a space for ourselves to unpick some of this. That's where coaching can come into play really well. And they are not on there. The other option, or the other thing we might want to play with, is inviting it in, is actually acknowledging it as being something that is part of who we are, part of how we process, and learning to live with it. I read a quote, I'm just going to read it out from someone in the New York Times, Carl Richards, in an article in the New York Times, who was quoted in his article as saying, the imposter syndrome hasn't gone away, but I've learned to think of it as a friend. So now when I start to hear that voice in my head, I take a deep breath, I pause for a minute, I put on a smile, and I say, welcome back, old friend. I'm glad you're here. Now let's get to work. Welcoming it in as part of who you are and how you make sense and work and do things. And the final thing for us, especially as people managers and leaders, is creating the right environment. So the role as a people manager is to create an environment for our teams to perform, to help remove obstacles that might be present. We've talked a lot about normalizing it, actively talking about your own experiences and creating an environment where we support and encourage each other, creating that psychological safety of helping people to know that when they speak up, that's okay. When they don't know the answer, they're not going to get shot down, that they may make mistakes, but it's about the learning from it. And also noticing some of the things that we've been talking about. So as a people manager, we're often the closest person to our colleagues and seeing them day to day. So we might see examples of where they're over-engineering work, where they're over-preparing, where they're maybe not putting their hand up for opportunities, when they're maybe generalizing or being really reluctant to take credit. Actually actively challenging that and helping people to see the evidence of their successes. So I'm going to open up. We've got a few minutes for questions. Just before I do, just want to signpost our next webinar, which is on dealing with grief and supporting our teams and our colleagues or ourselves when we might be dealing with grief at work. So we're working with hospice that we've been doing some work with for them to share some really practical ways of supporting others to manage grief and be with grief at work. So questions, reflections, thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to open up. Feel free to pop them into chat or to just take yourself off mute and speak if you'd like to too. Anything anybody would like to know?
Go on, Naomi, I'll take myself off mute and just I don't know if this is going to end up coming out as a question or just a general comment, but one of the things that I think has also been a bit of a buzz topic in recent times as well is becoming like hyper aware of like introverts versus like extroverts, and I'm definitely quite like an extroverted and chatty person, and I've seen it happen to some other people I know who are quite similar, of because especially when you're working with people who maybe aren't, you're often trying to get the balance between, like, for example, you're in a brainstorm about a topic you're quite excited about yourself, and maybe the imposter syndrome type thoughts aren't there, but because you know you're someone that likes to jump in and has a lot to say, you do feel like you're trying to get the balance right between being mindful of the different types of sort of communicators you're working with, but not sort of overcompensating too much for other people, to then almost like hold back your own ideas or expertise on the topic, and that can be quite difficult to get a balance for. It's not really a question, it's just a sort of observation.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I can really hear what you're saying. It's almost that how do we, and I know it's not a question, but you're raising that reflection point about how do we walk this fine line maybe between really allowing everybody to collaborate and contribute in a way that works for them, whilst we're trying to be aware of not holding ourselves back and not censoring ourselves or stopping ourselves bringing ideas, and that fine line. And we can become like, I'm all for developing self-awareness, but we don't want it to be at the point and the expense of us being able to function. Am I analyzing? Should I do this? Should I not do this? And I know you didn't phrase it as a question, but for me, it talks very much to a role that we can play in creating different types of environments and opportunities for people to collaborate in different ways. So understanding the people that we're working with as part of a project or within our teams, their preferences, how they work best, what they respond to, and then creating environments and ways of maybe coming up with ideas that allows them to do that. So doing maybe, for example, that silent brainstorming where everyone comes up with ideas independently and then reviewing them together. How do we draw on preferences to make sure everyone has an environment that works for them? Mandy, were you going to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you talked before about people in their, let's say, first week, year of work. And I just wondered if you could suggest any places to find sort of templates for personal development plans that people can use to just help them sometimes get through that first year or first 6 months of work, either that they complete themselves or they can do with line managers, or that we could use, you know, with people with support or our team.
Great question. I know you pick. I've got some thought. I know you picked that one up, Timo, when you talked. I mean, that for me, I'll just start off and say, we talk a lot about the idea of 100-day plans often, and having people think about what do they want to achieve in the first 3 months, and then that can then be okay, and then the next 3 months, to make it really practical and outcome focused, so I can have a look at something around that. Absolutely. Anything else, Timo, from your experience that you found helpful?
I think we work in a bit of a similar way, with indeed setting objectives that are short-term enough so that they can be really practical, measurable. I think also important is to be close to that person and to personalize it for him or her, because I think it's not only about the template, it's also understanding where that person comes in with what type of expertise already, or what's new, or what's, I think it's important to be close and personalize that strategy around the person itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Hopefully that helps, Mandy, but we can pick that up separately as well, and I can think about some resources that might be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I mean, just one really quick follow-up question. So if you're just going to focus on the first 3 months, but you know, you need to get to somewhere in the next 12 months, then do you start, you know, if you were creating some sort of plan, would you include maybe those 6 months or 12 months sort of objectives, or will you just kind of just focus exactly on the first 3 months and then revisit it?
So I'm just going to,
sometimes things just seem really overwhelming and just,
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to answer your question, but I'm just going to say to everybody else, because I'm conscious we're at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. Stay on if you want to listen to the kind of the kind of discussion about that point. Interact with us. Thank you so much, Timo, for being part of the conversation, and we will share out some information in the recording afterwards, so you can watch back if you were half distracted by something else as well. But thank you for joining us and spending your afternoon with us today. Mandy, I'm going to stop. I'll carry on the recording of this question, and then I'll stop. For me, and Timo might have different views as well, for me, it's important to do a bit of both. So if we definitely want to achieve something in 12 months, it's having that in our minds, and not just thinking short term of this 3 months, but breaking down that. Renee's giving some thoughts there, if you have a look in chat as well. Breaking down, okay, so what do I want to achieve? What's the 3 months? What do I need to achieve in this 3 months that's going to help with that? So it's that idea of that sort of salami effect. To achieve that, what are the smaller steps that are needed? And therefore, what do I tackle first? But having an eye on ultimately where you want to get to, I think, and then revisiting that. So a bit of both, I suppose, would be my answer. Timo, do you want to add anything else?
No, I exactly agree, and also with the point that Renee makes, like it's about making that 12-month plan, but maybe not throwing that instantly at that person, but having that at the back of our minds, and then breaking it down into shorter, more tangible things that you can, do on the short term. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Good. We can have further chat if it helps, Mandy. But thank you so much, everybody. Thank you again, Timo. And we'll hopefully see you at another one of these conversations really soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.